my big introduction. Okay.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Anjali Smith. I'm a senior at Emma, as many of you know. So I spent the past year for my signature project translating a travel log that my grandfather wrote, and it was about my grandmother. So how many of you remember, if you're already 17 or beyond, how many of you remember what you were like when you were 17? Yeah, so well, a lot of you are 17 right now, but for any alums out there, you were finishing your final year at Emma. Anyone else, you were looking forward to college, it was your final year of high school. This is me at age 17. I found bacon in my chocolate chip cookies, so I was unhappy about that. But for any of you, were you about to get married at age 17? Yeah, so at age 17, my grandmother lived in a small state in India called Kerala. It's one of the most southernmost states. She was going to school to become a teacher, and all of a sudden she met my grandfather, who was 38 at the time, and a week later they got married. This is not so common in India anymore. It was an arranged match. My grandfather actually arranged it, but back then it was relatively common. So this is my grandfather. Due to a poor investment on his father's part, his family was left without money for college for the rest of his siblings, so he abandoned his school plans. He was going to go to grad school to become a physicist, and he worked to pay his siblings' way through college. After he did all of that, and actually while he did all of that, he got a master's degree in Malayalam literature. So Malayalam is the language spoken in Kerala, which is the state that my grandparents are from. And after all of that, he actually ended up getting a PhD in chemistry and getting a Fulbright scholarship to Harvard, which is where he is in this photo. And at the time that he met my grandmother, he was traveling to Scotland to do postdoctorate work in organic chemistry. So a small side note, because at this point my grandfather might seem like the villain because he's like taking away the potential from my grandmother for her future, but he was very much a proponent for women's education. So his sister was, his father arranged a match for his sister, and he ended up going to her wedding and asking her, do you really want to get married or do you want to get more education? And she said, well, I'd really like to keep studying, and so he stole her away from the altar and put her through more school and ended up finding a love marriage for her eventually. He has 4 daughters, all of whom he educated equally as much as he educated his one son, and they're all doctors now. And my grandmother actually, after they got married, ended up pursuing a bachelor's, master's, and did some work towards a PhD. So why did I pursue this project? So I've always been interested in languages. I've studied quite a few, like French and Chinese and Latin, and I've sort of grown up speaking Malayalam with my mother, but my reading and writing skills were pretty elementary, so I thought this would be a good way to learn how to speak. I'm the only grandchild who was, of the 10 or so grandchildren, who was interested in pursuing this, and my grandfather actually died 25 years ago, so I never got a chance to meet him. And my grandmother is approaching the age that my grandfather died, so I figured if I was going to do it at any point, I should do it now while she's still around to like provide insight. I chose to translate this travelogue out of all of his other works because I just thought there would be more of a connection because she's 17 at the time, and I'm 17 right now. So this is a page from the travelogue. This is what Malayalam looks like. So it was written by my grandfather, but it's actually from the point of view of my grandmother. So she's a naive girl leaving her country small village for the first time and going on a trip to London, halfway across the world. And it was actually intended for audiences back in her hometown. So he would send it back to a magazine there, and it was sort of a serial of their adventures, traveling towards London. And it was for people like my grandmother who were equally naive and would likely never travel, but it gave them a way to see the world through the eyes of someone like them. And actually, my grandmother's mother, this was the way that she got news about how their trip was going, through these serials that my grandfather would send back, because telephones were So a bit about the Malayalam language, which is what the travelogue is written in. There are 14 vowels, so each vowel has an emphasized counterpart. So like that's A, and that's A, E, E. There are 36 consonants, and like the vowels, there are non-emphasized and emphasized counterparts, so ka, kha, ga, kha, nga. And it's one of the few truly phonetic languages. So as you can see, there are 5 rows of the vowels here, and that's because they're grouped into, I guess, the 5 parts of your mouth that make the sound. So this is, the scientific term is like guttural, palatal, retroflexal, dental, and labial. So if you just look at the last letter in each of the rows, it's nga, nya, na, na, and ma. So the sound kind of progresses from your throat to your lips as you go down the alphabet. There are also modifiers. So instead of doing ka and e, you can just do ka and then add a small symbol at the end, which we call modifiers, to make it sort of a compound. And it's grammatically very different from English. So kind of like German, the vowel is always, or sorry, the verb is always at the end of the sentence. And it's also like German and Latin in that there are various declensions. So if you're saying, I spoke to him, you don't have a separate to word. It's just a different declension of the word him. So it's just like a sound you add on to the end. So I grew up speaking colloquial Malayalam with my family, but the travelogue is written, since my grandfather had a master's in Malayalam literature, it's a little more formal, so that was a bit of a challenge. Just an example of the modifier. So this is the letter for ka, and that's e. So instead of writing them both out, you can just do ka with that candy cane, and it makes it ki. So this is an excerpt from the travelogue, and I translated it. I didn't end up translating from Malayalam straight to English because it's so grammatically different. So I ended up going word for word first. So like this isn't really proper English. And then I went from the word for word to sort of more natural English. So this is Avara Chodju. So she asked, Ningal Avare Varanda, which is where are you from? And so my grandmother responds, Trivandrum, which is a city in Kochi in Kerala. And so the woman asks, oh, Perenda, and my grandmother responds Vilasini, so it's my grandmother's name in Malayalam, which is kind of cool. This is actually a conversation she had with a woman on the ship they were traveling in. So the ship was going from Kerala, it was going from Mumbai to London, but it was a pretty large cruise liner. So this was the 1950s, so it's like a cruise nowadays, but it was more advanced for its time, I guess. And so there were people of all different nationalities because it had stopped in Japan and Singapore and Sri Lanka on the way to London. So she got to meet a lot of very different and diverse people after having come from her small hometown, which was pretty cool. So a bit about the travelogue. In it, there are a lot of cultural aspects that we, as Americans, maybe aren't so familiar with. So I've learned a lot about that. So this is a well sweep, which is a type of well used more commonly in, I guess, tropical climates. So instead of the normal pulley system like wells have here, it's more of a lever. So there's a balance and there's a weight here, and you pull it down to get water. And my grandmother actually used to sit in the bucket and ride it down into the well and back up as her mother got water, which is maybe not the best idea. This is just another like perspective of the well sweep. My cousin, who's an architecture student in India, actually did that to me. Another interesting thing I learned was she came across someone known as a Mutachi Amyar, which is a widow. It's normally a practice in Tamil Nadu, which is a adjoining state to Kerala, that when a woman becomes widowed, she shaves her head and carries all her worldly possessions in a bag. So on the train journey from Kerala to Mumbai, my grandmother had never encountered this because Kerala is a more matriarchal society. So women's rights and women's power were a little more prominent in Kerala, and so it was just an interesting cultural difference that she noticed in Um, so I've definitely learned a lot more of the language. So a lot of vocab that I didn't know I've learned. And also I was able to talk a lot more with my grandmother. It gave me an excuse to call her, which was nice. And I've definitely learned a lot more of the written language, which was really nice because it's not as common anymore for Malayalam to be spoken or written except in Kerala really. So it was just cool to have that connection to my heritage. So my final product for this project will be a document which is the English version of the travel log. So I'm hoping to include pictures of my grandmother and like the well sweep to explain various things that American audiences might not be so familiar with. And I was thinking it might be able to go in the Emma archives because I see this travel log as an example of a woman sort of broadening her horizons. So even though she is getting married at a really young age, she's able to travel and experience a lot of things she would not have otherwise. And she did end up pursuing higher education after marrying my grandfather. So eventually it would be very cool to publish a more refined version of the English travel log at some point. So this is the link to my blog. This is a photo of my grandparents after they got married. In my blog I detail about various chapters that I translated, and I go into a bit more depth about what's really going on in the travel log and just a little more plot points. So if you're interested, I have slips of paper up there with the link to my blog. So unfortunately, since my grandfather died over 20 years ago, I didn't really get a chance to know him, but through my travel log, I feel like I'm getting to